The cylinder head is basically the top half of an engine. It houses the valves that let air and fuel into and out of the combustion chamber, along with the coolant passageways to the thermostat, and the top mounts the rocker arms and springs that actuate the valves. Because the cylinder head is a physically separate piece of iron from the block it bolts to, there's a gasket that separates them. The single most important on any vehicle, the cylinder head gasket on the Jeep 4-liter has 3 primary directives. It has to seal oil from the outside of the block and against the coolant passages, which it also has to seal from the combustion chamber. These 3 different areas have to be kept separate from each other because none of them mix well, and as a result, a head gasket can fail in many ways. If coolant mixes with the oil, you'll find a sort of chocolate shake residue from the drain plug or dipstick. Coolant is terrible at lubricating, and oil is terrible at cooling, so both systems are compromised, and the result, if driven long enough, is major internal engine damage. If oil mixes with the combustion chamber, you might notice white or blue smoke from the tailpipe and pressurization in the crankcase, which can blow out other oil seals. If enough exhaust gets into the crankcase or you lose enough oil, the result is major internal engine damage. If coolant mixes with the combustion chamber, you can usually smell that from the tailpipe. You'll start to lose antifreeze over time, and the cooling system will overpressurize, which might make the radiator cap expel some of it out. If the cooling system loses enough effectiveness and the engine overheats, the result is major internal engine damage. You can also have a head gasket fail between 2 different combustion chambers, so neither of them can build compression. And without compression, they won't be doing anything, so you'll notice a decrease in available power and fuel efficiency. The engine will misfire pretty bad, and in the worst cases, fail to stay running at all, which at least means it can't cause any major internal damage to itself.
That smells like coolant. That's like thick. It smells like I can smell it, and I can't smell anything. Well, let me just go to the nearest parts store.
The head gasket is subject to the most brutal forces in any part of the vehicle, so for a failure at 298,000 miles, I think that was a job well done. However, this XJ, being a 2001, has the fabled 331 casting cylinder head, and it is entirely possible the gasket is fine, but the head itself has cracked.
So I am geographically located in the middle of nowhere. I'm actually at the tri-point marker between Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. That's how middle of nowhere we're talking about here, okay? Now, my head gasket failed. How do I know that? It misfires. The exhaust smells like coolant. It runs like shit. Well, you know, and it misfires. It's kind of the same thing. It's down on power. It can't really hold 65 going up a hill, that sort of thing. I've noticed this over the past day or so. The coolant is low. So coolant's going somewhere. It doesn't usually do that in this Jeep. I smell coolant in the exhaust. It's running like shit. Coolant is missing. It's got to be a head gasket. Could be a cracked head, I guess, but usually the head cracks will mix coolant with the oil and not coolant with a combustion chamber. And the oil looks good. So I don't think it's a cracked head. I think it's just a failed gasket. I've also taken out the fuel pump relay. So now there's not going to be any fuel entering the engine. All I'm going to do is crank it over, and we're going to listen for inconsistencies. So you can hear every time it spins over, it skips. I think we're down on compression.
In a situation like this, in eastern Colorado, over 1,000 miles away from home with no money, you might be tempted to use some sort of head gasket fix in a bottle. But as I've said before, do not ever use these products, even in a dire emergency like this. It might clog up the hole in your head gasket, but it'll also clog up literally everything else too, so you're shooting yourself in the foot by needing a new radiator, definitely a heater core, and leaving an unhealthy supply of gasket repair materials in all sorts of places they shouldn't be inside your engine. From 2000 to 2002, the Jeep 4-liter used a different cylinder head than all prior years. The casting method was changed to make it lighter for emissions reasons. But this had a pretty detrimental side effect. A defect in this casting made the iron between cylinder 3 and 4 too thin, and because the straight 6 is so long, these heads usually crack right in the middle. I find they usually only do so when overheated, but I have seen them fail right off the showroom floor. They can crack for any reason at any time, or last 300,000 miles with no issues. The 331 is essentially a random dice roll that just denotes how long you'll have before the inevitable failure. Now, because Chrysler is a cheap shit brand, there was never a recall for this, but they did make a revised design starting for model year 2003. The 331 TUPY casting fixed the cracking issue, but by then the XJ had been discontinued. The only Jeeps out there that would have these newer cylinder heads are the Grand Cherokee WJ and the Wrangler TJ. But how do we know if the head is cracked or if it's just the gasket? Unfortunately, you can't tell for certain until the head is removed, when you can take it to a shop and have them Magnaflux tested. The cracks are usually thinner than a hair, so they can be impossible to see with the naked eye. But the magnetic field of the cast iron is disrupted, so it is possible to find cracks, but that doesn't really help us before we have it all apart. This video will specifically apply to the 2000 through 01 XJs when I mention the 331 cylinder head. If you have a 96 to 99, you'll have a 0630 cast head, and they don't usually ever crack, so you guys can follow along for the gasket replacement. Older than 95 and you've got different electrical and fuel systems, but generally speaking, the overall replacement process is the same for every model year of the 4-liter. Like I said, the head gasket can fail in a few ways. I find on the 4-liter, they mostly rupture between cylinder 3 and 4. You can perform a compression test, and if a pair of cylinders has lower compression than all the others, you can bet the head gasket failed between them. Either that, or if coolant is somehow magically disappearing, if you can confirm there's no leaks anywhere, even from the heater core, the only other way it could be disappearing is from a head gasket. Now, if you have a 2000 plus, you can confirm which cylinder head you have by looking at the top of it from the intake side, under the heat shield if equipped. This is a 0331. Then look directly under the oil cap. If that surface is plain, it's one of the bad ones, prone to crack. If it says TUPY, well, then it's a good one. Now, I have a 331 with symptoms of a failing head or gasket, which means I have a few optional routes for how to tackle this. I can assume it's the gasket and keep the original 331 testing it for cracks after I get it off. I can assume it's the head and get a TUPY 331 from a yard. Or I can assume it's the head and get a brand new head from a place like Edelbrock or Clearwater. Because this is my only vehicle now, I'm not going to chance it. If I had money, I might go with a shiny brand new cylinder head from Clearwater, but because I don't, I found a TUPY from a 2004 Grand Cherokee in a pick and pull yard for $100. I then took that head to a local machine shop to have it inspected, cleaned, and resurfaced. The guy installed new valve seals, vacuum tested the valves, and smoothed out all 3 of the gasket mating surfaces for a grand total of $100. For the gasket, Rock Auto sells full kits with every gasket you need for the complete job. There are composite gaskets and multi-layer steel gaskets. Where MLS gaskets do provide a better seal, they can only do so if the surfaces are laser level clean, which you can't really do with some sandpaper and a paint scraper at home. Composite gaskets are designed to crush into the small pits and imperfections of a 300,000-mile engine surface, so that's what I recommend if you're tackling this with just hand tools. I went with Engine Tech. This kit, linked in the description, includes everything you need, even a new set of head bolts. The cylinder head bolts on most engines are torque to yield, which means when you completely tighten them down, they ever so slightly stretch. This means they can only be used once, and while many will tell you the 4-liter doesn't care, I like to be extra thorough with my projects and leave nothing to chance. The kit also includes a manifold, valve cover, throttle body, exhaust flange, and thermostat gasket, along with a set of valve seals and all the rubber grommets for the valve cover bolts. Even new O-rings for the fuel injectors, which we don't need to remove. So for $75, I think that's the best deal I could find. Everything I used is listed in the description, so here's the game plan. The cylinder head is basically 4 other projects combined at once. The manifolds, thermostat, spark plugs, and valve cover all bolt to it, so all of those things have to be removed. I have separate videos that cover each of those in much greater depth than I will here, and I recommend watching at least the manifold video if you've never had them off before. Now, Ben is going to tell you can get the head off with the manifold still bolted to it. I know that. You can do that, but I wouldn't try it unless you're an experienced mechanic who knows what you're doing, which is probably nobody watching this video. I'm also going to be using a different cylinder head, so in my case, I do have to remove the manifolds anyway. The thermostat can stay bolted on if you're reusing the cylinder head, and so can the spark plugs, but I'll be swapping both those out.
I'm throwing in the towel at 299,352. Today's the day. For tools, we got sockets from 1/2 inch to 11/16 on the Imperial side and 8mm to 15 on the metric side. Whole bunch of extensions and swivel joints for the manifolds. Screwdriver, the only wrench you'll need is a 9/16. Got a metal wire brush for cleaning up some threads, pliers, dikes, a scraper, and some little sandpaper pads. I got this little thing at Walmart for like $5. It turned out to be very nice. We got a breaker bar for breaking the head bolts loose. The only deep sockets you need are 10mm, 7/16, 1/2 inch, and 9/16. On the note of 1/2 inch, you have to get 12-point ones. This is a 6-point. So I've got a 1/2 inch drive, because the breaker bar is a 1/2 inch drive. Use the big one to break them free and the smaller one to torque them down. But they have to be deep sockets because the head bolts, some of them are studs. I also have a random little piece of rubber hose that fits around a head stud. You'll see why that's important later. Just about 1 inch of any old hose will do. Teflon tape and a spark plug socket if you're gonna remove your spark plugs. I've got a spill-proof funnel, a whole bunch of rubber gloves, and a well-calibrated torque wrench. You have to change out the oil and all the coolant whenever you do this, so 3 gallons of coolant and 6 quarts of oil.
We start with disconnecting the battery, and in this case, I'll actually remove it entirely to free up some space here later on. Then the air box comes out, which I don't have bolted down. And I mean this in a non-insulting way, but if you don't know how to get the air box out, you shouldn't be removing a cylinder head. This is a fairly advanced job with a lot of potentially expensive consequences for screwing something up. Next, I remove the throttle cables, leave the kickdown and cruise cables on the passenger side and the accelerator cable on the driver's side. Then start ripping out all the vacuum lines and electrical connectors on the manifold, which again I cover in much more depth in the manifold video. There are 5 vacuum lines on a 2001, I'll just shove them all as out of the way as I can get them. Then I unplugged all the engine harness connectors, the IAT, map sensor, TPS, IAC, and the 2 upstream O2 sensors. The fuel injectors are the only connectors you can mix up, so they might be worth labeling, but they also commonly break.
Problem is, these always break. This one is snapped. You can see kind of where it's cracked in there. So what we can do is get a tiny little pick in the bottom of it and pry up, and then take it off. I can't do this with one hand, but you can see what I'm doing here, right? Just get like a small screwdriver or something, and you can lift up the bottom of the tab and then slide the connector off.
The plastic harness guide is very easy to break. Be careful with that thing too. Then just get all the wires out of the way and set them over on the passenger side of the engine. Then I went for the electric fan, unplugged that, 2 8mm bolts, a side of bread ties, and repeat that process for the other fan shroud too, if you feel like it. Crack the belt tensioner pulley free, loosen the belt, and get it out of there. The power steering pump has 3 1/2-inch bolts behind its pulley reached with a short extension, and then I just set that where the airbox used to be. The belt tensioner mounts to the block with a 9/16 bolt and 2 more on the water pump. Now I'll disconnect the fuel line, first relieve fuel pressure by pressing in this Schrader valve. My Jeep's been sitting overnight, so there's none left. Get this lock clamp out of the way to slide a 3/8 quick disconnect tool in there. And finally, on California emissions models, detach these two brackets for the upstream O2 sensor connectors. Now we unbolt the intake manifold. Using my left arm, I can reach under it to aim the socket onto each bolt, and cleanly remove the 4 lower ones first. As I discussed in the manifold video, I think starting with the lower bolts is definitely the way to go.
Now comes the easy part.
The 4 upper bolts are easy with a swivel joint, and then the intake pops off the engine. Be careful which way you tilt it, as the fuel rail is still going to have gas in it. The exhaust manifold doesn't need to come out of the vehicle. We can just detach it from the cylinder head with 2 nuts and the last center bolt. Without the manifolds in the way, this 11/16 nut for the ground strap is pretty easy to reach. And now, without any chance of dropping manifold hardware into a 5-gallon bucket, I drained the coolant, which, despite looking pretty brown, does look a lot better than it used to. Those coolant flushes are gradually working. Then take the 2 hoses off the thermostat housing, and the other heater hose off the water pump, which always seems to put up a fight for me. Then I removed the thermostat housing, which again, this can stay on the engine if you're putting the same cylinder head back on.
That poor thing. Still works though.
Now we're done with the driver's side of the engine. Let's move over to the passenger side by putting the wiring harness over there, and also get those coolant hoses away from the engine. I'll unbolt the AC compressor for some more working room. You don't have to do this, but I think it makes things easier, especially on the coil rail models. 4 half-inch bolts, one of them stripped the threads on the bracket, so I had to pry it out, but then I'll just set the compressor where the battery used to be. Make sure not to pinch those wires. Now unplug and remove the coil rail. On 99 prior models, you can just disconnect the spark plug wires, no need to remove the distributor. On 2000 plus models, I guess it could technically stay on the head, but man, just take it off. Then you don't gotta worry about breaking it. Starting in mid-model year 2000, you might have a static reducer that mounts to this stud on the head, which has to be disconnected. If your Jeep doesn't have this here, no big deal, you don't need it. There are 2 9/16 bolts that mount the AC compressor bracket to the cylinder head. You can remove these with the compressor still installed, it's just a lot more tedious. There's another one and a nut behind and below the bracket that I also like to loosen. The idea here is this gives the compressor bracket a little bit of free motion, which helps align the cylinder head when we put it back on. Now that we're done with the passenger side, we can work from the top down. 15 bolts of this 7/16 variety secure the valve cover, and don't worry about which ones are studs, I'll show where they go later. I got the gasket out of there, and now we can remove these fancy things. Stock 4-liter rocker arms just bolt to the head with 1/2-inch hex heads, but these require a 1/4-inch Allen bit. It is important to keep the rocker sets and push rods in the same position they've been removed from, because they wear to each other. Using the box my head gasket came in, I made a stencil, and with each rocker set removed, it and its pair of push rods go in the same order they came out. When my head gasket failed, a bunch of people told me it was the head that cracked, which it is a 331, I'll give you that, but based on cylinder 3 and 4 both losing compression and the fact that my oil always looked fine, I was pretty confident that it was just the gasket. So I had everyone place bets, which they'll see the results of by the end of the video.
Got all the rocker arms out. Now I can actually get a good look at this cylinder head. The 331 really likes to crack right around here. I've sprayed a little bit of brake cleaner in there to clean up the area, see if I could locate a crack. That does look like a crack, if you ask me. I don't know. I don't know if that's some sort of like casting mark or what, but the rest of the crankcase does look clean. There's no evidence that coolant was mixing with the oil. I never lost any oil. I was only losing coolant, and I know the coolant is all brown, but that's just because it's rusted in there. There was no evidence that oil was mixing with the coolant, and I still don't see any evidence that oil was mixing with the coolant. So if this is a crack, it would have been mixing coolant and oil, because this is where the oil is, and the coolant is right under that. We'll see.
Now that everything's removed, it's time to get the cylinder head off. On a lot of engines, it's procedure to remove the head bolts in the reverse order of the torque sequence, which means we'll start with bolt number 14 and work an inward spiral. I couldn't fit my breaker bar on the first bolt, so I just used a ratchet with a cheater bar instead. And that's it, just crack them free for now. Now, because I'm not reusing this cylinder head, because it's probably not ever going back on another engine, the order I break these bolts free doesn't matter. The 4-liter doesn't seem to care honestly anyway, but again, I like to be thorough and it is good practice. Bolt number 11 is going to feel a little different than all the others, because it threads into a cooling passage, so the threads on it need some kind of sealer on them. And you'll have to excuse these incessant neighbor kids screaming at random points. They saw I was making a video and decided that was how they wanted to be remembered on the internet. I kind of screwed up the order at the end here and skipped bolt 3 and 4, but yeah, it doesn't matter.
Jeez. Last one, come on. There it is. Now, as we remove the head bolts, we'll make note that all of the studs are on the manifold side, and all the bolts are on the spark plug side, except for these two, which just have little dowel pins on the top of them. Those two are going to go in the second from the last bolts under the valve cover. Now you just rip all these head bolts out. And these ones are really rusty somehow, which is why they put up a bit more of a fight. Look at that one, damn. So definitely don't want to reuse these. And there's problem number A. So on the XJ specifically, head bolt number 14 can't come out with the engine still in the vehicle because it hits this flange on the firewall. So there's two ways to get around that. You can either bang this flat with a big ass sledgehammer. That's what Ben did. That'll allow the bolt to come out. Otherwise, this bolt's gonna have to come out with the cylinder head. Now, how I do that is in the background of some past videos, you may have noticed this random piece of rubber hose zip tied here. I use this as a thick washer. There we go. It spaces up the threads so that they're not sticking out of the bottom of the head and allows us to lift it off of there very nicely. So now it's time to get the head out of here, and this thing weighs like 500 million pounds. Now here's a fun little fact about me. I took a weightlifting class in high school, and aside from a kid who dropped out, I was dead last. So I can't lift anything very heavy very far for very long at all. I'm gonna try to do this by myself. If you have a second person, that makes it way easier. I'm sure you've seen in the past, I like to climb in the engine bay and sit like right here, lift the head off the engine and hand it to somebody who's standing right here, and they can go put it down somewhere. So you're gonna need a couple things. You're gonna need somewhere to put the head. You're gonna need probably a second person to grab it from you when you lift it off of the engine. And if you want, you can take the header panel off. It is kind of an involved process if you want to go that route, but without the radiator support or the header panel, you can get your body a lot closer to the engine, which makes it easier to lift the head off of here. So I'm just going to set up the camera on the tripod and hope I don't drop it on my toe. Another thing before we lift it off here, make sure everything is disconnected from it. Some of your 2000 plus models are going to have this stud here, which is on the cylinder head, not on the block. Make sure this thing is disconnected and somewhat loose. And watch out for this water pump pipe if you didn't take the water pump off. We're gonna have to go around that. And I guess the first thing is we have to make sure the head is separated from the engine. So I like to stick a breaker bar in this exhaust port and just pry up on it. So now we know that the head is gonna come off when we lift on it. So the rearmost stud that holds the exhaust manifold on is getting caught on the exhaust manifold. That's what's going on here. And these neighbor kids are just incessantly screaming. They've been doing that all day. There we are. Okay. There goes my back. Now remember, if the gasket is compromised anywhere, it means the cylinder head is more than likely not cracked. So if we see some sort of multi-lane interstate highway exchange system between cylinder 3 and 4, I think we can pretty definitively say that I have quite possibly the only 331 that's lasted 300,000 miles. I should have also mentioned earlier there are 2 dowel pins on the engine block that you have to lift the cylinder head over to get it off. Now, I don't know if this is a factory gasket, but I don't see any evidence that anybody's ever torn into this engine. There are brand markings on it.
This was a Victor Reigns gasket, which means it has been replaced before, which by extension means I have no idea how long it lasted, but I have heard good things about this brand. Now you can take a look at the inside of the engine and get a sense of how it's doing. You'll first notice this ring of rust around the top edge of the cylinder wall, which, well, certainly isn't good, also doesn't really affect anything because it's above the rings. You want to look for the cross-hatching, these tons of X-shaped lines that run along the cylinder wall. These are a good sign of a well-running engine. This block is not in the best shape, but it is still serviceable. The gasket definitely had a lot of miles on it, which points to a potential replacement relatively early in this Jeep's life. I had Trinidad run a VIN report on it, but there are no official records of this ever being done. I am this Jeep's 5th owner. Its 4th was a countryman, lived in the middle of nowhere, who used it as a farm truck where it racked up both a lot of miles and idle hours. I did ask him if the head had ever been replaced when I bought it, but he had no idea. Perhaps it was, and they just threw another 331 on it, not knowing any better back in the day. The pistons have a lot of carbon buildup, especially on cylinder 6, which did also develop a slight misfire about the same time the gasket failed. Cylinder 6's spark plug had this white chalk-like substance on it. Ash deposits from burning oil, likely from leaking valve seals, can mask the electrode and prevent a spark from happening, which would result in a misfire. The rest of the cylinders and spark plugs also displayed these same patterns, just less so. And I actually missed my spark plug change interval by 15,000 miles, so I finally bought a new set. With your engine bay looking like this, some might recommend replacing the lifters, which can only be removed with the head off. I wouldn't though, it's just another thing to worry about, and I bet they still work fine. Besides, when we go that far into the engine, you gotta worry about them wearing to the camshaft, and I don't know what any of that means, so for now, let's just worry about the head gasket.
Now I'm going to begin the very tedious process of scraping off all the old gasket. It can get pretty stuck, especially over on this side, where it just seals oil. The main surface seems to come off pretty nicely, and try not to get as much stuff into the crankcase as possible. It is still full of oil. I like to do the oil change after we're done, just so that some of the particles that fall down in there inevitably are gonna get changed out pretty much immediately before we start the engine. The hardest part to reach is back here by the oil dipstick. It's kind of hard to get a scraper right there. And around these dowel pins too. Just did the best I could. We're gonna go over it with some sandpaper briefly. The rest of this seems pretty okay though. I did have to scrape down these little triangle spots though. I just bought one of these cheap shit ass sandpaper things from Walmart. I've got 120 grit on there now. Let's see how it does with this first before I do the main block surface. Well, it's doing pretty good. Not that much pressure on this now. Okay. Yeah, that's doing pretty decent.
Start with a scraper to get off the bigger pieces, then right around 100 grit sandpaper to shave off most of it. After that, some brake cleaner on a towel will soak up the powder. I know this doesn't really look that clean, but that gasket material will literally get baked into the metal. All we can do is get the surface as flat as possible.
The surface on the far edge here, it always puts up a hell of a fight. So I had to step down to 80 grit, and it is starting to get it off of there. As for the rest of the surface though, I'm probably just going to go over at once with 220 grit. Definitely don't want to scratch up the compression surface. This ridge along here is a lot less important.
I spent at least 30 minutes just doing this. The cleaner and smoother you can get the block, the better. Now, a professional would tell you to get a straight edge with a feeler gauge to determine if the mating surface is flat enough, but you know, just feel it for anything abnormal. This is why we're not using an MLS gasket. And take your time here. This is not a job you want to do twice. Now that whatever remaining gasket material has been dissolved into a powder, I'm going to clean the engine with brake cleaner. Now, do not go crazy with this. Brake cleaner is literally the worst thing you can put in an engine after, I don't know, sand. So just quick light sprays to get carbon off each piston and also clean the mating surface. You can see how much came off with just a paper towel, which you also got to be careful not to get pieces of in the engine. You can spin the crank pulley with a 3/4 to rotate the pistons to the top of their stroke because ideally you don't want to get anything on the cylinder walls. Before you put the head on, the factory service manual advises coating each cylinder wall with oil just to be safe.
Whenever you remove the head, it's pretty much inevitable that you're going to spill coolant all over the engine. So I like to take some time and just wipe out the cylinders so they don't have any water in them.
Cleaned up, I went over it all with my hand one more time just to be sure I didn't miss anything. Don't be afraid to bust out the 220 grit sandpaper again. With more advanced tools, there's definitely more surefire ways to get this surface as flat as possible, but I don't have said more advanced tools, and neither do you probably, so again, just take your time.
Now that I'm pretty content with how clean the engine surface is, we can start prepping the cylinder head. Now, if you're going to replace the cylinder head, you're going to want to swap over your spark plugs. I just bought new spark plugs, so I'm going to leave the old ones in the other head. This one, I took it to a machine shop. The guy cleaned it up for me. All the surfaces are ready to be mounted up, including the bottom of it here. Very nice, very clean, professionally cleaned. So this one is ready to get bolted on. I'm going to put the spark plugs in when it's on the engine. Now, if you're going to put your same cylinder head back on, you are going to need to clean this up too. The valve cover mating surface, the manifold surface, and the underside where it meets the engine block, which can be about as tedious as cleaning the engine block itself. So now that the head's ready to go on, we can put the gasket in place. It is directional. The one side is going to have these two ports for the cooling passages at the very back. So that should be about the only way you can mix it up, is forward backwards. We'll just set that on there and go get our cylinder head ready. And remember, before we put the head on, this bolt, this last corner bolt's got to go in with it. So I grabbed a new one out of my new set, put it in my spacer, and go throw it in that corner hole in the cylinder head. So I'm first gonna just set it in here. I'm not gonna try to line it up on my first go. I just want to get it sitting on top of the engine. Jesus. It's probably not good to let it stab into the gasket like that. As I've said, this is way easier with multiple people. Don't be careful not to step on any wires or fuel lines or anything. And I'll try positioning it like this. Okay. Make sure that's back there. Obviously, the cylinder head is directional. Make sure the thermostat housing is on the front. And then there's those two dowel pins. There's one like right under here and one under this corner. We can't just slide it around on there. And I gotta lift it up and try to find those dowel pins. There they are. There's one. There's the other one. Okay. Don't want to slide it around too much with the gasket just loosely sitting under it. Might break something. But there we go. We got our rearmost new head bolt in here. We didn't crush any wires, and I didn't die.
You can hand tighten all the bolts. All the studs go on the driver's side, and the 2 dowel pin bolts go in positions 8 and 9. Bolt 11 requires thread sealer, specifically Loctite PST 592, according to the factory service manual. Kind of weird to see something without a Mopar part number in there. I got that linked below, but I always use Teflon tape. I've done this job about 5 times now, never had an issue with plain old generic Teflon tape. Then just go around and snug all the head bolts with a ratchet, ready for the torque sequence. You have to follow this order and 3 torque stages, starting with 22 foot-pounds. For the torque specs on screen, the first number is in pound-feet and the second number is in newton-meters. After all the bolts are at 22 foot-pounds, we go to 45. If you have a newly cleaned cylinder head like this one, you should put like a teaspoon of oil on each valve spring just so they don't start dry the first time. In the moment, I simply didn't think of doing that, so when we start the engine, you'll see what happens.
Alright, the next stage is 45 foot-pounds. Now, the next step in the sequence is 110 foot-pounds, but between 45 and 110, that's a pretty big jump. Yeah. So I like to add a 4th torque in there, just for good measure. I do 85 foot-pounds because that's about halfway between 45 and 110. I've seen people snap off head bolts by going from 45 to 110 right away. So it doesn't hurt to do another one at 85. Oh yeah. Yes, very good. Okay, now we can go to 110. Except this torque wrench only goes up to 100. Alright, let's break a sweat doing this. It's a good workout. It's gonna go to 100 and then a little bit more.
You'll break it.
You're gonna break it.
Because this torque wrench doesn't go up to 110, I just turned each bolt maybe like a 16th of a turn beyond 100. Obviously, that's not dead accurate, but if you don't tell anyone, I won't either.
Well, this one only goes to 100.
Remember that, bolt 11, the one with thread sealer, only goes to 100 foot-pounds.
Stop right there. Then we're back to 110. Okay. Whew.
Then reattach that static reducer, also a perfect time to clean up the ground stud on the oil dipstick.
I also re-equipped this rearmost exhaust manifold stud, and the front one came out with the nut, so that one's pretty easy. These are an E6 inverted Torx if you want to unbolt them the proper way, but you can just grab onto them with vice grips. After the head's torqued, go ahead and put all your push rods in, remember, in the correct order. And then you can start assembling your rocker arms. This is what stock 4-liter rocker arms look like. They just bolt down there. But I got my fancy racing ones.
When you put the rocker arms on, make sure each push rod is seated in the small divot for it on the bottom. These are torqued to 21 foot-pounds whether you have the fancy racing ones or not.
Doesn't matter if any of them are on their intake or exhaust strokes. You can torque them down all the same. Alright, now I'm going to lay in the valve cover gasket, which is also directional. This oval shaped hole goes towards the back, I think, probably. And they sit on these, on the head bolts that have the dowel pins on top of them.
You'll have to clean up the valve cover and optionally replace all the rubber bolt inserts, which I discuss in the CCV video.
Go ahead and put in all the valve cover bolts. The only studs you got to worry about are this one, right in the middle, next to the oil cap. The only reason that needs to be a stud is for this thing that just mounts the heater hoses. And then this one at this back corner, which just mounts the wire harness, if you even still have this little tab on here. The rest of the studs, it doesn't matter where you put them, so I just like to put them all over here. Somehow I lost one of these spacer things for the valve cover bolts. I don't know where the hell that is, but I don't know, I'll just steal one from a yard next time I find one. Not that big of a deal. I'll go ahead and tighten down the compressor mount bolts, even these ones if you loosen them, and I went ahead and put in all the spark plugs.
Connect the coil rail or the wires. The firing order is 153624 if you didn't label the wires. Coil rail is torqued to 21 foot-pounds, not that that's really important at all. The compressor bolts go to 20, but that's also not important. Then connect all the coolant hoses over here, and with this side of the engine assembled, it's back to the manifolds.
Clay told me to tell you to not forget the manifold gasket. That's kind of an important thing. With the exhaust manifold on, I am again enacting my manifold installation tactic, where we just leave the 4 lower bolts threaded in by maybe half a turn. Do that. Okay, there we go. And now you can reach down there and tighten at least one of them. And that'll hold it there just barely. Probably do this before you put the manifolds on, but don't forget the ground strap nut. Now that's all the manifold bolts torqued down. Remember, there is a sequence for these too. At this point, it's just a matter of reconnecting all sorts of wires and vacuum lines and cables and everything. Alright, with the help of Bob the cat, I've managed to get all the vacuum lines and the wires connected. I go into a lot more detail in the manifold video. So now I'm going to put on the belt tensioner and the power steering pump and the electric fan, and then I got to do an oil change and fill it up with coolant. Okay, now we're going to put in the air box.
Assembly really is the reverse of removal. Just keep putting things in until you run out of things to put in. And remember to do an oil change.
Alright, the sun is setting. We need the hood light. Uh-oh. Hood light's not working, Clay.
What?
We might have screwed something up with the head gasket. I say we as if you were here the whole time. There we go. Alright, so we got the spill-proof funnel going, filling up the cooling system. I just changed the oil and the filter, refilled it. I think we're ready for startup.
I'm recording.
Okay.
You're wasting time.
Oh no. Pretty bad lifter tick until the oil got pumped up in there, but there we go. Running nice and smooth.
I demonstrate how to use a spill-proof funnel in either the water pump or radiator video if you want to replace either of those, but just let it run for a while. Check for oil leaks, coolant leaks, listen for any misfires or weird noises, and then go on a test drive.
I don't think I've ever heard it run that smooth. So after you get everything put back together, just gonna let it idle for a while. Let it burn oil off of the exhaust manifold. Let the coolant get circulated through it. We just gotta wait for it to get up to temperature. We're about halfway there. It's got good oil pressure. Oh yeah. And I fixed target idle not reached. Finally.
After your first 1,000 miles, you might want to do another oil change to play things safe, and rid the crankcase of any gasket particulates that fell in it. This oil actually looks really good though, so I'm glad I just went for some cheaper stuff for this one. The drain plug goes to 25 foot-pounds. I have been using Rotella T5 oil, which the 4-liter does really like, but then Napa had their fancy oil on sale, and the 4-liter also really likes this stuff. I mean, it'll take any oil, it doesn't care. Check the description for a lot of links, clarifications, a list of tools. I don't know, it's a mess. But with that second oil change, you're back on the road with a newly refreshed 4-liter. With clean valves, brand new spark plugs, and of course a new head gasket, it felt like it was new again. It does make rattling noises, but it's old. It still has 300,000 miles on it. A head gasket isn't going to change that fact, but it will probably get you 300,000 more.
And with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.